29 hours underwater. That's how long most people can survive without air, without light, without a single soul knowing they're still breathing. Harrison O'Keefe beat that number by more than 50 hours. He sat alone in total blackness, chest deep in freezing ocean water, breathing air that was slowly turning into poison, while the only people looking for him were searching for his corpse. This is the true story of a ship's cook who became one of the most extraordinary survivors in modern history, pulled from a coffin made of steel at the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean. It was the early hours of May 26, 2013. The tugboat Jaskin 4 was working off the coast of Nigeria, escorting an oil tanker near the Chevron terminal at Escravos. 12 men were on board. The sea that night wasn't calm. Swells rolled hard against the hull, and the water churned with the kind of restless energy that experienced sailors learn to respect and never trust. Harrison O'Keefe was the ship's cook. At 42 years old, he'd spent years working these waters, cooking meals for crews who spent months at a time away from their families. That night, like most nights, he woke before dawn to use the bathroom before starting his shift. It was a routine so small, so unremarkable, that he probably didn't think twice about it. He never made it back to bed. Without warning, the Jaskin 4 lurched violently to one side. Metal groaned. Loose objects crashed across the floor. Within seconds, what should have been a controlled vessel became a ship fighting for its life against a wave that refused to let go. The tugboat rolled and rolled again, and then it kept rolling until the deck that Harrison had walked on just moments before was now somewhere above his head, and the ceiling had become the floor. The Jaskin 4 capsized completely. Then it sank, dragging itself and everyone aboard nearly 100 feet down to the ocean floor. Picture that moment. You're standing in a bathroom. The lights flicker and die. Water starts pouring in from every direction, and the entire room you're standing in begins to spin, flipping upside down while you're still inside it. There's no time to think, no time to brace. Your body just reacts, grabbing for anything solid while the sea tries to claim you. Harrison was thrown violently through the collapsing structure of the ship. Water surged around him, cold and merciless, filling every space it could find. He was certain in that chaotic, tumbling darkness that he was going to die. Not eventually, not someday. Right then, in the freezing dark, drowning inside a ship that had betrayed everyone on it. But something happened that shouldn't have. As the vessel settled upside down on the seabed, a small pocket of air became trapped in one of the compartments, a bathroom no bigger than a closet. Harrison found himself gasping, choking, but breathing. Actual air, not much of it, and getting worse by the hour, but enough for now to keep him alive. He had survived the initial disaster. What came next would test something far harder to measure than physical endurance. Complete darkness. Not the kind you get in a bedroom at night, where your eyes adjust and shapes emerge from shadow. Complete, absolute darkness. The kind where you can hold your hand an inch from your face and see nothing at all. Harrison was alone in it, chest deep in cold seawater, trapped inside an air pocket roughly 4 feet high, inside a bathroom, inside a boat that was now lying upside down on the ocean floor. He had no idea what had happened to the 11 other crew members. He had no idea if help was coming. He had no idea if anyone even knew the ship had gone down. All he had was the sound of his own breathing, the lapping of water against the walls, and the growing, suffocating certainty that he might be the only living thing left in this steel tomb. Most people, faced with that kind of isolation, that kind of sensory deprivation combined with mortal terror, would break within hours. Harrison O'Keefe did not have hours to spare on breaking. He had a decision to make, and he made it quickly. He was going to survive this, or he was going to die trying every possible way to survive it. He started by taking inventory of his situation with his hands, since his eyes were useless. He found a life vest floating nearby and pulled it on. He found pieces of wood and foam mattress material drifting in the trapped water, and he lashed them together into a crude platform, something to keep as much of his body out of the freezing water as possible. Hypothermia is as real a threat as suffocation, maybe more immediate. The water around him was cold enough to steal heat from his body every second he sat. He knew that staying submerged too long would kill him just as surely as running out of air. So he built himself a shelf above the waterline, a fragile raft made of scraps, and he settled onto it in the dark, knees pulled to his chest, listening to a ship that groaned and shifted around him like something alive and dying. Then came the hunger. Not for food, though that came too, eventually, but hunger for information, for certainty, for anything that would tell him what was happening beyond the walls of his tiny prison. He had none of that. What he had was time, an unbearable, crawling abundance of it, stretching out in front of him with no way to measure how much of it he had left. He thought about his wife. He thought about his children. In the pitch dark, with nothing to look at and no way to know if it was day or night above the surface, his mind kept returning to their faces, replaying memories like a film reel, because it was the only form of light available to him. Somewhere outside, in the daylight, he could no longer see. A very different story was unfolding. Search and rescue teams had been mobilized. Divers had been sent down to the wreck. But their mission wasn't rescue. It was recovery. As far as anyone knew, all 12 men aboard the Jaskin, 4 had died the moment the ship went under. Nobody survives being trapped underwater for more than a day, let alone longer. The plan was grim and practical. Locate the bodies, bring them home to their families, close the case. Divers had already recovered several bodies from other parts of the wreck in the days following the sinking. Each one confirmed what everyone already assumed. There would be no survivors. It was simply a matter of finding everyone and bringing them up. Meanwhile, Harrison sat in his air pocket, and the air itself had become his enemy. Carbon dioxide doesn't announce itself with a smell or color. It just accumulates, quietly, invisibly, thickening the air with every breath a trapped person exhales, with nowhere for it to escape. Harrison could feel the effects building inside him, a heaviness in his skull, a fog settling over his thinking, a nausea that came in waves. He didn't know the science of what was happening to him. He just knew that breathing was getting harder, that his thoughts were slower, that something inside that little pocket of survival was running out. He drifted in and out of something like sleep, though real rest was impossible. Every few minutes, water sloshed against him as the current shifted somewhere in the wreck, and his mind would jolt awake, certain that this was it, that the air pocket was finally collapsing, that the ocean had come to finish what it started. Hours became something he could no longer count. He estimates now that he survived somewhere close to 60 hours in that space. 2.5 days, alone, in the dark, breathing air that was becoming less breathable with every passing minute. No food, almost no fresh water beyond what he could find trapped in small pockets around him. Nothing to do but wait and hope and fight the growing voice in his mind that told him hoping was pointless. On the 3rd day of the search operation, a team of divers from a Dutch salvage company descended once again into the wreck. Their task, as it had been for days, was to locate and recover the remaining bodies. They moved carefully through the flooded, upside-down corridors of the ship, using guide ropes and flashlights to navigate a structure that made no logical sense anymore, where up was down and every hallway led somewhere disorienting. One of the divers pushed his light into a small compartment, and in that beam of light, something moved. A hand, reaching toward him, not the stillness of a corpse. Movement, life. The diver would later describe that moment as one of the most terrifying experiences of his career, not because it was dangerous, but because it defied everything he understood to be possible. He had been sent down to recover the dead. Instead, in the crushing dark of a sunken ship, 3 days after it went under, a living man had just reached out and grabbed his arm. Harrison, on his end, had heard something approaching in the water, a mechanical sound, unfamiliar, growing louder. After nearly 3 days of nothing but silence and the groan of settling metal, any new sound could have meant anything. It could have been another shift in the wreckage, another sign that his tomb was about to close in further. Instead, it was salvation arriving in the form of a stranger in a diving suit, pushing a light into the one space in the entire wreck where a human being was still breathing. The rescue itself was its own kind of ordeal. Harrison couldn't simply be pulled to the surface. His body had spent nearly 3 days adjusting to the pressure at that depth, and rising too quickly would have killed him just as surely as drowning would have. He had to be placed into a diving bell and brought up slowly, methodically, through a decompression process that took hours, his body forced to readjust step by step to a world it had nearly given up on returning to. When he finally emerged, blinking into daylight after 3 days of absolute darkness, Harrison O'Keene became something the world had almost no framework for. A man who had survived underwater, trapped in an air pocket, for longer than almost anyone in recorded history. His story spread fast, covered by news outlets across the globe, each one struggling to convey just how close to impossible his survival actually was. Of the 12 men aboard the Jaskin, 4, Harrison was the only one who made it out alive. The other 11, his crewmates, men he'd cooked for, worked alongside, shared long nights at sea with, did not survive the sinking. That fact would stay with him long after his body recovered from the physical toll of his ordeal. Surviving something like that doesn't end when you're pulled from the water. In many ways, it's just the beginning of a different kind of struggle, one that plays out quietly in the mind long after the cameras and headlines move on. Doctors who examined Harrison in the aftermath were stunned by how physically intact he was, all things considered. Dehydrated, exhausted, disoriented, but alive, and without the kind of catastrophic organ damage many expected given the conditions he'd endured. His survival has since become a case study, referenced by researchers and rescue teams studying the outer limits of human endurance underwater. What made the difference? Partly circumstance, the sheer luck of an air pocket forming in exactly the right place at exactly the right size. But partly, and maybe more importantly, it was Harrison himself. His decision, made in the first chaotic seconds of the disaster, to keep moving, to build a platform out of debris, to conserve his energy, to keep his mind occupied with the practical business of staying alive, rather than surrendering to the panic that would have been the easier, more natural response. There's something worth sitting within that. Most of us will never face anything close to what Harrison O'Keene faced in that flooded, capsized tugboat. But the instinct he leaned on, the refusal to stop trying even when logic said the situation was hopeless, is something that echoes far beyond that one bathroom at the bottom of the ocean. It's a reminder of what people are capable of enduring when survival becomes the only acceptable outcome. Years later, Harrison O'Keene still carries the memory of those 60 hours with him, a weight that never fully lifts. He's spoken publicly about the experience, about the strange, isolating nature of surviving something so extreme that few people can truly understand it, even when they're trying their best to listen. He lost colleagues that night. He lost a version of himself that existed before the Jaskin, rolled over into the dark. But he also gained something almost nobody else on Earth can claim. Proof, written into his own survival, of exactly how far the human will to live can stretch before it finally breaks. It very nearly did break him, but it didn't. And that difference between nearly and actually is the entire story. If this story moved you, if you found yourself holding your breath right along with Harrison in that dark, flooded room, let us know in the comments. Stories like this deserve to be remembered, and remembered accurately, which means we need your help spreading them further. Hit that like button before you go, subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, and tap the bell icon so you never miss the next incredible true story we bring you. We'll see you in the next one.